I thought I was celebrating the biggest achievement of my life when my parents invited me for Sunday dinner after my nursing graduation. 28 years old, finally holding my RN degree, ready to start my career at Children's Hospital. Frank and Patricia had prepared my favorite pot roast, and even my 19-year-old brother Jake seemed genuinely happy for me. Then somewhere between passing the mashed potatoes and cutting the perfectly browned meat, they dropped a bomb that shattered everything I believed about family belonging and my future. "Nellie, you should know you're adopted," Frank said casually, his fork never pausing. "And when we die, you get nothing. Everything goes to Jake since he's our real son." The words echoed in my head for 3 days before I could process what had actually happened. Adopted. Nothing. Real son. I kept replaying that dinner, searching for signs I'd misunderstood, but Frank's cold delivery and Patricia's nodding agreement left no room for interpretation. They'd waited 25 years to tell me, choosing my moment of triumph to crush my spirit completely. I'd moved back into my childhood bedroom temporarily while apartment hunting, and suddenly every corner of that space felt contaminated with lies. The pink wallpaper I'd begged for at age 10, the achievement certificates covering one wall, the photos of family vacations where I always stood slightly apart from the group. Now I understood why. My hands shook as I started packing boxes, throwing clothes and books together without care. That's when I found them wedged behind my old dresser where they'd probably fallen years ago. 3 official-looking documents bound with a rubber band, hidden in plain sight like secrets tend to be. The first page made my knees buckle. Adoption decree finalized when I was 3 years old, not an infant like Frank and Patricia had claimed during their devastating revelation. But it was the second page that stopped my heart completely. Under biological mother, someone had typed Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. Morrison. My grandmother's maiden name was Morrison. Dorothy Morrison, who died 6 months ago, leaving me more bereft than I'd expected. The coincidence was impossible, absolutely impossible, unless it wasn't a coincidence at all. I stumbled downstairs with the papers, my mind reeling with possibilities that seemed too incredible to believe. Frank was watching television while Patricia folded laundry, both of them acting like they hadn't just destroyed their daughter's entire sense of identity 3 days earlier. "What is this?" I demanded, shoving the adoption papers toward Frank's face. "Sarah Morrison is that grandma's daughter?" Frank's expression shifted from annoyed to genuinely alarmed. He snatched the papers from my hands, his eyes scanning them quickly, while Patricia dropped the towel she'd been folding. "Where did you get these?" Patricia's voice was sharp, almost panicked. "These were supposed to be sealed." "They were in my room. Answer me. Is Sarah Morrison Grandma Dorothy's daughter? Is that my real mother?" Frank stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame suddenly seeming menacing rather than paternal. "You need to leave. Tonight. Get your things and get out of our house. I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth about who I really am." "The truth?" Frank laughed bitterly. "The truth is, you're an ungrateful brat who's been living off our charity for 28 years. We gave you a roof food education, and this is how you repay us, snooping through private documents and making accusations." Jake emerged from the kitchen with a smirk, his phone already recording. "This is going straight to TikTok," he announced gleefully. "Adopted sister has mental breakdown when she finds out she's not getting our money." The casual cruelty in his voice broke something inside me. This boy I'd helped with homework driven to soccer practice defended against bullies was filming my pain for social media entertainment. "Frank, call the police if she's not gone by morning." Patricia said, her arms crossed tightly. "I won't have her disrupting our peace anymore." I looked around the living room where I'd spent countless evenings doing homework, watching movies, believing I belonged. The family photos on the mantel suddenly looked different. In every single one, Frank, Patricia, and Jake stood close together, while I hovered at the edge, always slightly separated from their tight circle. "Fine," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'll leave, but this isn't over. Not until I know who Sarah Morrison really is." Frank's face went completely white, and Patricia actually stumbled backward a step. Their reactions told me everything I needed to know. Sarah Morrison wasn't just some random woman who shared my grandmother's maiden name. She was connected to this family in ways they desperately wanted to keep hidden. I spent that night in a 24-hour diner drinking coffee and staring at those adoption papers until the words blurred together. By dawn, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find Sarah Morrison, and I was going to learn the truth about why Frank and Patricia had just thrown away 28 years of family bonds in a single dinner conversation. The first apartment I could afford was a studio above a bakery 40 minutes from the hospital where I'd be starting work. As I signed the lease, my phone buzzed constantly with texts from Jake, sharing videos of my breakdown with his friends. Not a single message from Frank or Patricia checking if I was safe, if I'd found somewhere to live, if I needed anything after being essentially disowned overnight. Moving day was a solitary affair. I hired 2 college students to help load my few belongings into a rented truck, and as we drove away from the only home I'd ever known, I realized I felt more relieved than sad. The house that should have represented safety and love had been a prison of secrets and conditional acceptance. But the adoption papers rode in my purse like burning coals, and Sarah Morrison's name echoed in my thoughts with every mile that passed. Somewhere out there was a woman who might hold the key to understanding why the people I'd called parents had just erased me from their lives with such calculated precision. My studio apartment came furnished with exactly 4 pieces of furniture, none of them comfortable, but it felt more like home than Frank and Patricia's house ever had. Freedom has a particular smell, I discovered. It's part dust, part possibility, and part terror of the unknown. I threw myself into research with the same intensity I'd brought to nursing school. Every free moment was spent at the public library, hunched over microfilm readers and ancestry websites, following the trail of Sarah Morrison through decades of public records. The breakthrough came on my 3rd day of searching. A yellowed newspaper clipping from 29 years ago buried in the archives of the local Herald Tribune. The headline read, "Local woman disappears after giving birth." Below it was a grainy photo that made my hands start trembling before I'd even read the article. The woman in the picture had my eyes. Not similar eyes, not eyes that reminded you of someone else's, but my exact eyes, looking back at me from 3 decades in the past. The same unusual hazel color with gold flecks around the iris, the same slightly upturned outer corners, the same way of looking directly at the camera with a mixture of hope and wariness. Sarah Morrison, 19, vanished from Valley General Hospital 3 days after giving birth to a daughter. The article continued. Hospital staff reported Morrison seemed anxious and frightened during her stay, frequently asking about security measures and visitor restrictions. The infant has been placed with loving relatives while authorities continue searching for the missing mother. Loving relatives. The phrase felt like a slap across the face. Frank and Patricia weren't my parents, weren't even my adoptive parents in the traditional sense. They were relatives who'd taken in Sarah Morrison's baby when she disappeared, and somehow convinced everyone, including me, that this arrangement was normal and legal. But why would Sarah Morrison disappear right after giving birth? And why would she be asking about security measures unless she was afraid of someone? I photocopied the article and drove straight to Maple Street, where Dorothy Morrison had lived her entire adult life. The house stood empty now, a "for sale" sign tilting slightly in the overgrown front yard. But I wasn't interested in the house itself. I wanted to talk to the neighbors, the people who'd watched this family's drama unfold over the decades. Mrs. Henderson answered her door cautiously, peering at me through thick glasses that magnified her pale blue eyes. She was at least 80, with silver hair carefully pinned in a style that hadn't changed since the 1970s. "I'm Nellie," I said simply. "I lived with Frank and Patricia down the street. I think you might have known my grandmother, Dorothy Morrison." Her expression shifted immediately, suspicion replaced by something that looked almost like relief. "Oh, honey, you have her eyes, you know. Dorothy's eyes. She used to stand at her kitchen window and watch you playing in that yard, tears just streaming down her face. Why was she crying? Mrs. Henderson glanced nervously up and down the street before opening her door wider. Come in, child. There are things you should know, things that have been weighing on my heart for too many years. Her living room was a museum of floral patterns and lace doilies, but her voice was strong and clear as she settled into a rocking chair that creaked with age. Dorothy had a daughter named Sarah, beautiful girl with a spirit that couldn't be contained, smart as a whip but drawn to the wrong kind of excitement, if you understand me. When Sarah was 18, she got mixed up with some dangerous people. Drug dealers, I think, though Dorothy never said so directly. What happened to her? Sarah got pregnant and the father wasn't someone you'd want knowing where you lived. Dorothy tried to convince her to come home, but Sarah was terrified. Said if certain people found out about the baby, they'd hurt everyone she cared about. Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Sarah gave birth and vanished the same week, leaving that precious baby with Dorothy. But Frank and Patricia stepped in, said they could provide better stability than an elderly woman. They had legal connections. Frank's father was a prominent attorney, and before Dorothy could fight it, they'd convinced a judge to award them custody. So I am Dorothy's great-granddaughter. Honey, you're more than that. You were the light of Dorothy's life, even though she had to love you from a distance. Frank and Patricia made it very clear that any interference from Dorothy would result in them moving away where she'd never see you again. The pieces were falling into place, but each revelation brought new questions. Do you know what happened to Sarah? Is she still alive? Mrs. Henderson rocked silently for a long moment, her gnarled fingers working at a handkerchief. Dorothy never stopped looking for her daughter. Hired private investigators contacted missing persons. Organizations spent thousands of dollars chasing leads that went nowhere. Right up until she died, Dorothy believed Sarah was out there somewhere, probably still afraid to come home. But she never found her. Not exactly. Mrs. Henderson's eyes met mine directly. About 6 months before Dorothy passed, she got very excited about something. Kept saying she'd discovered important information that justice was finally going to be served. She mentioned hiring a new attorney, someone who specialized in family law and criminal cases. My heart started racing. Do you know the attorney's name? Walsh, I think. Benjamin Walsh. Dorothy said he was going to help her fix old mistakes and protect the people she loved. I left Mrs. Henderson's house with more questions than answers, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving toward truth rather than running away from lies. Dorothy Morrison had been searching for Sarah Morrison right up until her death, and she'd been working with an attorney to address family injustices. As I drove home through the gathering dusk, I realized I'd been thinking about Dorothy as Frank and Patricia's relative, a distant grandmother figure, who'd been kind but peripheral to my real life. Now I understood she'd been my closest blood relative, forced to watch her great-granddaughter grow up believing strangers were her parents. But most importantly, if Dorothy had been working with attorney Benjamin Walsh on family issues right before she died, then there might be more to her death than anyone realized. Maybe Dorothy Morrison hadn't just been a sweet, elderly woman who'd passed peacefully in her sleep. Maybe she'd been fighting for something or someone right up until the end. Finding Benjamin Walsh took exactly 1 phone call to the State Bar Association, but reaching him took 3 days of persistent messages left with a secretary who clearly specialized in protecting her boss from curious strangers. When he finally returned my call, his voice was cautious, but not unfriendly. "Miss Morrison," he said, and hearing my real last name spoken aloud made my chest tighten. "I've been expecting your call, though not quite this soon." "You have..." Dorothy left very specific instructions about when and how to contact you. "I'm afraid I can't discuss details over the phone, but I can meet with you tomorrow if you're available. There are things you need to see." Walsh's office occupied the 3rd floor of a restored Victorian house downtown, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound books that smelled like old wisdom. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with graying temples and eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "Before we begin," he said, settling behind a desk covered with neat stacks of documents, "I need to ask if anyone else knows you're here today." "No, should they?" Dorothy was very concerned about certain people learning of our work together. She had reason to believe that Frank and Patricia Morrison might take drastic action if they discovered she was investigating family matters. Morrison. He'd used Frank's last name, but that wasn't right. Frank had married into the Morrison family when he'd married Patricia, unless Patricia was also a Morrison, which would mean she was Dorothy's daughter, too. "I think there's been a confusion," I said slowly. "Patricia's last name was Henderson before she married Frank. She's not a Morrison." Walsh's eyebrows lifted slightly. Patricia Henderson Morrison. She legally changed her name back to Morrison after her first marriage ended in divorce. Patricia is Dorothy's youngest daughter, which makes Frank your adoptive father and your step-uncle by marriage. The room tilted sideways for a moment. Patricia was Dorothy's daughter. Frank had married his deceased wife's sister. I'd been adopted by my biological great-aunt and her husband, and nobody had thought to mention these family connections at any point during 28 years. "This is getting very complicated," I whispered. "It's about to get more complicated," Walsh said gently. Dorothy spent the last 3 years of her life documenting what she called a pattern of systematic abuse and fraud perpetrated by Frank and Patricia against multiple family members, including you. He opened a thick file folder and removed a key, old-fashioned and brass, tied with a blue ribbon. "Dorothy asked me to give you this if something happened to her before she could resolve these issues personally. She said you'd know where to use it." I stared at the key, my mind racing through memories of Dorothy's house, searching for locks it might fit. Then I remembered the cedar chest in her attic, the one I'd noticed during family visits, but never thought to examine closely. Dorothy used to joke that it contained family treasures too precious for prying eyes. "There's more." Walsh continued, his voice becoming more formal. "Dorothy Morrison changed her will 6 months before her death. She left her entire estate, valued at approximately $5 million, to her great-granddaughter, Nellie Morrison, with very specific conditions attached to the inheritance. $5 million. The number was so large, it didn't feel real. I'd been worrying about making rent on a studio apartment, and my biological great-grandmother had left me enough money to buy the entire building. What kind of conditions? You'll need to read Dorothy's letter first. Everything she wanted you to know is in that chest, along with evidence she gathered over several years. Dorothy was convinced that Frank and Patricia had committed serious crimes, not just against you, but against her, and possibly other family members. "What kind of crimes?" Walsh leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "Financial fraud, elder abuse, possibly extortion." Dorothy believed they'd been systematically stealing from her while convincing her she was losing her mental faculties. She also suspected they'd been intercepting communication between you and her, preventing you from developing a relationship that might have exposed their activities. I thought about all the times I'd wanted to visit Dorothy more often, but Frank and Patricia had always discouraged it. Too tiring for an elderly woman, they'd said. Better to let her rest quietly rather than overwhelming her with young people's energy. I'd believe them, accepting their judgment about what was best for Dorothy's health and peace of mind. She wanted to see me more often, didn't she? Dorothy called my office at least twice a month asking about legal ways to spend more time with you. She'd planned birthday parties you never attended, Christmas celebrations you were told had been canceled, family dinners that supposedly weren't happening. Frank and Patricia told her you were too busy with school, too social with friends, too focused on your own life to visit an old woman. Each revelation felt like another small death. Dorothy had been reaching for me while I'd been accepting Frank and Patricia's explanations for her absence from my life. She'd wanted a relationship with her great-granddaughter, but the people I'd trusted to guide my family connections had been actively preventing it. "I need to see what's in that chest," I said, standing up abruptly. "I thought you might." Dorothy's house key is also on that ring. She wanted you to have access to everything she'd gathered, but she was very specific about one thing. You needed to be completely certain of your decision before opening that chest, because once you see what's inside, there's no going back to the way things were. There's already no going back. Frank and Patricia made sure of that when they told me I was adopted and would inherit nothing. Walsh's expression hardened. They told you what? Last Sunday, right after my nursing graduation. They said I was adopted, I'd get nothing when they died, and everything would go to Jake, since he's their real son. Dorothy died 8 months ago. Her will was read 6 months ago, and Frank and Patricia were informed they'd been removed as beneficiaries in favor of you. They've known for 6 months that you inherited everything, and they chose to tell you the opposite. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They'd let me believe I was cut off and alone, while knowing I'd actually inherited wealth that would ensure my security for life. They'd watched me struggle with finding an apartment, worry about student loans, stress about starting my career with no family support, all while sitting on knowledge that could have changed everything. They wanted me to suffer, I said quietly. Dorothy believed they wanted you to disappear entirely. She thought they were hoping you'd move away, start a new life somewhere else, and never discover your inheritance or the truth about your family history. I gripped the brass key so tightly it left marks on my palm. Dorothy Morrison had spent her final years fighting for me, gathering evidence to protect me, and ensuring I'd eventually learn the truth about my family. Frank and Patricia had spent those same years trying to erase me completely. I'm going to that house tonight, I said firmly. I need to see what Dorothy left for me. I'll meet you there, Walsh replied, already reaching for his coat. Dorothy made me promise to be present when you opened that chest. She said you'd need a witness for what comes next. Dorothy's house stood silent in the twilight, its windows reflecting the dying sunlight like closed eyes. I hadn't been inside since her funeral 6 months ago, when Frank and Patricia had hurried everyone through a brief reception before shooing us away so they could begin the difficult process of settling her affairs. The brass key turned easily in the front door lock, and stepping inside felt like entering a time capsule. Everything remained exactly as Dorothy had left it, her reading glasses on the kitchen table. A half-finished crossword puzzle folded beside her favorite coffee mug, a sweater draped over the living room chair where she'd spent countless evenings watching game shows and waiting for phone calls that rarely came. She knew she was running out of time, Walsh said softly as we climbed the narrow stairs toward the attic. The last month of her life, Dorothy was almost frantic about getting everything organized for you. The attic access required pulling down a wooden ladder and climbing up into the musty space felt like ascending into family history itself. Boxes labeled with decades lined the slanted walls, and in the far corner sat the cedar chest I remembered from childhood visits. Dorothy had always made the attic seem mysterious and special, a place where family treasures lived safely away from everyday concerns. Now I understood the real treasure hadn't been stored in the chest. It had been the woman herself, and I'd barely gotten to know her before losing her forever. The brass key fit the chest's lock perfectly, and as I lifted the heavy lid, the scent of lavender and old paper rose up like Dorothy's own perfume. Inside, hundreds of envelopes were organized into neat stacks, each stack labeled with different years, spanning back 25 years. My dearest granddaughter, Nellie, read the first letter dated just after my 5th birthday. Today you lost your first tooth, and Patricia told me you were too shy to let the tooth fairy know. I wanted to come over with a special coin and a story about brave little girls, but Frank said you needed your sleep more than excitement from an old woman. I read 3 more letters with increasing amazement. Dorothy had documented every milestone, every achievement, every moment she'd wanted to share, but been prevented from experiencing with me. Birthday parties she'd planned, but been told to cancel. Christmas presents she'd bought, but been told not to give. Bedtime stories she'd written, but never been allowed to read. She wrote to you every week, Walsh said, watching me discover the depth of Dorothy's love and frustration. At first, she thought Frank and Patricia were just being protective of your routine. By the time she realized they were deliberately isolating her from you, the pattern was too established to break without risking losing you completely. But it was the final stack of letters that changed everything. These were marked evidence and contained Dorothy's careful documentation of Frank and Patricia's financial manipulation over the past 3 years. I've discovered Frank has been using my power of attorney to transfer money from my accounts into his business. Read one letter dated 18 months ago. When I confronted him, he said I'd agreed to invest in his landscaping company, but couldn't remember due to my failing memory. Patricia showed me documents with my signature, but I don't remember signing anything related to business investments. The next letter was even more disturbing. I've started hiding this notebook because Patricia goes through my papers when she thinks I'm napping. She's been telling people I have dementia and can't manage my finances anymore. Yesterday, she suggested I might be happier in assisted living where professionals could monitor my health. The strange thing is my mind feels perfectly clear, except when I'm around them. Then I become confused and forgetful in ways that don't happen when I'm alone. They were drugging her. I whispered, the realization hitting me like ice water. Walsh nodded grimly. Dorothy became suspicious when she noticed her mental clarity improved dramatically during a 2-week period when Frank and Patricia were vacation. She started documenting her cognitive function daily, noting significant differences between days when they visited and days when she was alone. The final letter was addressed directly to me, sealed in an envelope marked "Open only after my death for Nellie's eyes alone." Inside, Dorothy's handwriting was shaky but determined. My precious Nellie, if you're reading this, then I've failed to live long enough to tell you these truths in person. Frank and Patricia have been systematically poisoning me with small doses of sedatives mixed into my food just enough to make me appear mentally incompetent while they steal everything your great-grandfather worked his entire life to build. But more importantly, they've stolen 25 years of our relationship by convincing you that I didn't want to be close to you and convincing me that you didn't want to spend time with an old woman. Every birthday party you missed, every holiday celebration that was canceled, every family dinner that never happened, all of it was their manipulation designed to keep us apart. I've hired attorney Benjamin Walsh to help me gather evidence of their crimes, but I suspect they'll escalate their efforts to control my estate before we can expose them legally. I'm changing my will to leave everything to you, including this house, and all the evidence I've gathered about their criminal activities. Most importantly, I've discovered that your biological mother, Sarah, is alive. She's been hiding for 28 years, afraid to contact you because Frank threatened to expose her location to dangerous people from her past. But I've found her, Nellie. She's been living under an assumed name in Oregon, working as a nurse like you chose to become, never knowing whether her daughter was safe or happy. I've arranged for Walsh to contact Sarah after my death so you can finally meet the mother who's been mourning your loss every day for nearly 3 decades. Frank and Patricia kept you both believing the other was gone forever. But love doesn't die just because cruel people try to bury it. Use my money to build the life you deserve, sweetheart. Use the evidence to make sure Frank and Patricia never hurt anyone else the way they've hurt our family. And use the truth to reconnect with Sarah because you both deserve to heal from the lies that have stolen so many years. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, and I'm proud of the strong, compassionate woman you've become, despite everything they did to try to break your spirit. Your devoted great-grandmother, Dorothy Morrison. I was sobbing before I finished the first paragraph, and by the end of the letter, my tears had spotted the paper in several places. Dorothy had died, knowing Frank and Patricia were slowly murdering her, but she'd spent her remaining time protecting me and trying to reunite me with my biological mother rather than just protecting herself. Sarah Morrison is alive, I asked Walsh through my tears. Dorothy located her 8 months ago, living in Portland under the name Sarah Collins. She's been waiting for this day, Nellie. She never stopped loving you or hoping you'd find each other again. But there was one more item in the chest that changed everything again. A small recording device with a note attached, "Play this last after you've read all the letters. This recording was made 3 weeks before my death, and it proves everything I've told you about Frank and Patricia's true nature." I pressed play with shaking fingers, and Dorothy's voice filled the attic space clear and strong despite her age. "Frank, I've decided to change my will again. Nellie should inherit the house and the bulk of my estate, not you and Patricia." Frank's voice cold and threatening. "Mother Morrison, we've discussed this. Your memory isn't reliable anymore, and making major financial decisions when you're not thinking clearly isn't fair to the family. My memory is perfectly fine when you're not drugging my tea." Patricia's sharp intake of breath, then Frank's voice turning dangerous. "That's a serious accusation, and frankly, it proves you're not competent to manage your affairs anymore. Patricia and I think it's time to explore assisted living facilities, where you can get proper medical supervision." "You mean where you can drug me more effectively and steal my money without interference?" "We'll have you declared mentally incompetent if necessary." Patricia's voice shrill with anger. "Jake deserves his inheritance, and we won't let your obsession with that adopted girl destroy his future. Nellie is not adopted. She's Sarah's daughter, which makes her more my family than you ever were." Frank's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting, "If you change that will, I'll make sure you don't live long enough to enjoy watching Nellie spend our money." The recording ended there, and the attic fell completely silent except for my ragged breathing. Frank had threatened to kill Dorothy if she left her estate to me, and 3 weeks later, she was dead. Walsh was studying my face carefully. "Are you ready to know the rest of it, Nellie? Because once we start down this path, there's no turning back. Frank and Patricia will discover they're about to lose everything they've stolen, and people like that don't surrender quietly." I looked around the attic where Dorothy had stored decades of family love and 28 years of documentation proving Frank and Patricia's systematic cruelty. She died trying to protect me and reunite me with my biological mother, and her final gift was the evidence I needed to make sure they never hurt anyone else. "I'm ready," I said firmly, closing the chest and pocketing the recording device. "Tell me everything." Walsh guided me downstairs to Dorothy's kitchen table, where he spread out financial documents that painted a picture of systematic theft spanning over 15 years. The numbers were staggering, but it was the methodical nature of the fraud that truly shocked me. "Your great-grandfather, Robert Morrison, built Morrison Landscaping from nothing," Walsh explained, pointing to incorporation papers from 1978. "When he died 12 years ago, the business was worth approximately $400,000 with established contracts throughout the county and a solid reputation built over 3 decades. I studied the business records, recognizing some of the client names from Frank's current company. But Frank owns Riverside Landscaping, not Morrison Landscaping. That's where the fraud begins. When Robert died, Dorothy inherited the business as his widow. She was 72 and had no interest in running a landscaping company, so she signed power of attorney papers, allowing Frank to manage operations while she remained the legal owner. Walsh flipped to a series of bank statements showing regular transfers from Morrison Landscaping to Riverside Landscaping. Frank convinced Dorothy to let him establish his own company to handle specialized services that Morrison couldn't provide. Slowly, he transferred every major contract, every piece of equipment, and every valuable client relationship from her company to his. That's theft. It gets worse. Frank then convinced Dorothy to sign dissolution papers for Morrison Landscaping, claiming the business was failing and needed to be shut down to prevent losses. She signed believing she was protecting her finances from a declining enterprise. The documents showed Dorothy signing away a thriving business that Frank had deliberately sabotaged by transferring all its assets to himself. She'd essentially given him permission to steal her late husband's life's work while believing she was making a sound financial decision. But how did Patricia convince Dorothy to trust Frank with power of attorney in the first place? Walsh's expression darkened. That's where the elder abuse becomes clear. Look at these medical records Dorothy kept hidden in a safety deposit box. The medical file documented Dorothy's visits to 3 different doctors over the past 5 years. Each physician had noted her complaints about memory problems, confusion, and difficulty concentrating, but only when she'd been around family members. When examined alone, Dorothy consistently tested as mentally sharp and completely competent. Dr. Sarah Kim became suspicious when Dorothy mentioned feeling foggy and confused only after family visits. Walsh explained. She recommended blood tests that showed elevated levels of diphenhydramine in Dorothy's system. That's Benadryl. In high doses, it causes confusion and memory problems in elderly patients. Exactly. Someone was giving Dorothy regular doses of antihistamines, just enough to make her appear mentally incompetent during important conversations about financial matters. I thought about all the times I'd visited Dorothy and found her sleepy or disoriented, how Frank and Patricia always explained it as natural aging or the effects of her various medications. They'd been systematically poisoning her to facilitate their theft, and I'd never suspected anything was wrong. The business fraud alone represents approximately $250,000 in stolen assets, Walsh continued. But that's just the beginning. Frank used the landscaping business as a front for money laundering operations that generated significantly more illegal income. He showed me surveillance photos of Frank meeting with men I didn't recognize in parking lots and storage facilities. Dorothy hired a private investigator 6 months before her death. Detective Maria Santos documented Frank's involvement with known drug distributors who needed legitimate businesses to clean their profits. The photos were damning. Frank accepting envelopes of cash, loading unmarked boxes into landscaping trucks, meeting with the same group of men repeatedly at locations far from his normal business routes. Frank created phantom landscaping contracts with shell companies, Walsh explained. He'd invoice non-existent clients for services never performed, then use Dorothy's business accounts to deposit drug money disguised as legitimate payments. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate nearly $200,000 annually for the past 3 years. Frank was running a sophisticated money laundering operation while using Dorothy's business credentials and financial reputation to legitimize criminal proceeds. The scope of Frank's crimes was overwhelming. He hadn't just stolen Dorothy's business, he'd turned it into a criminal enterprise that could have destroyed her reputation and exposed her to federal prosecution if she'd been discovered. Patricia handled all the bookkeeping, Walsh added, showing me falsified invoices in Patricia's handwriting. She created fake client profiles, generated fraudulent tax documents, and maintained parallel accounting systems that hid the true source of Frank's income. I stared at Patricia's careful handwriting documenting years of criminal activity. This was the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me about honesty and integrity, who'd claimed moral authority when lecturing me about responsible behavior. She'd been running a money laundering operation from her kitchen table while presenting herself as a respectable member of the community. Jake benefits from all of this, I realized. His private school tuition, his car, his college fund, everything came from stolen money. Dorothy documented every expense Frank and Patricia claimed as business deductions that actually funded Jake's lifestyle. Private tennis lessons, summer camps, designer clothes, the latest electronics, all of it purchased with proceeds from criminal activities. The cruelest irony was that while Jake enjoyed luxuries purchased with stolen money, I'd worked part-time jobs throughout high school and college to cover basic expenses. Frank and Patricia had claimed they couldn't afford extras for me while lavishing stolen wealth on their biological son. There's more. Walsh said, his voice becoming even more serious. The private investigator discovered Frank has been recruiting other elderly clients for similar fraud schemes. Dorothy's case isn't isolated. Santos had documented Frank approaching at least 3 other elderly clients, all widows without close family oversight. He'd offered to help manage their finances, suggesting power of attorney arrangements that would allow him to protect them from scam artists and unscrupulous salespeople. How many other families has he destroyed? We're still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests Frank has stolen approximately $1.2 million from elderly victims over the past 8 years. Dorothy was just his most profitable target because of her business assets and family trust. The weight of Frank's crimes was staggering. This wasn't just personal betrayal, it was a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable elderly people who trusted him because of his family connections and community reputation. Dorothy spent her final months gathering evidence to expose Frank's entire operation, Walsh explained. She knew she was dying either from the drugs they were giving her or from the stress of fighting them, but she wanted to make sure other potential victims were protected. What's our next step? Walsh gathered the documents into neat stacks, his movements precise and methodical. Dorothy's will includes a provision requiring Frank and Patricia to return all stolen assets and publicly confess their crimes or face immediate prosecution for elder abuse fraud and money laundering. They'll never agree to that. Which is why Dorothy also arranged for Detective Santos to turn over all evidence to federal authorities if Frank and Patricia refused to cooperate. The money laundering charges alone carry 15-year sentences, and elder abuse convictions would add additional time. I thought about Frank's reaction when I'd found the adoption papers, how quickly he'd demanded I leave the house, how panicked Patricia had become. They'd known this day might come, but they'd hoped I'd disappear quietly without discovering Dorothy's evidence. They'd been living with this fear for months, I realized. Knowing Dorothy had hired investigators knowing she'd changed her will, wondering when everything would catch up with them. Dorothy wanted them to experience the same anxiety and helplessness they'd inflicted on their victims, but she also wanted to give them one opportunity to confess and make amends before destroying them completely. Walsh handed me a thick envelope sealed with red wax. Dorothy's final instructions. She wanted you to decide whether to offer Frank and Patricia a chance at redemption or proceed directly to criminal prosecution. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, weighted with 28 years of lies and the power to finally balance the scales of justice. Dorothy had given me the choice between mercy and retribution, trusting me to decide what would best serve the cause of justice. I need to think about this, I said quietly. Take your time, but remember, every day Frank and Patricia remain free is another day they could be targeting new elderly victims. Dorothy died to protect people she'd never met from suffering the same betrayal she experienced. As I drove home through the dark streets, I realized Dorothy had given me something more valuable than $5 million. She'd given me the power to ensure Frank and Patricia never hurt anyone else, and the responsibility to use that power wisely. The question was whether justice meant offering them a chance at redemption or making sure they faced the full consequences of 28 years of systematic cruelty. Dorothy's sealed envelope contained instructions that felt like receiving orders from beyond the grave written in her careful script during what must have been her final coherent days. Her handwriting grew shakier as the pages progressed, but her determination remained crystal clear. My dearest Nellie. The letter began, "If you're reading this, then Frank and Patricia have either confessed their crimes voluntarily or you're preparing to expose them through legal channels. Either way, the recording device in this envelope contains conversations they never intended anyone to hear." The device was newer than the one I'd found in the chest, sleek and digital with a small screen showing dozens of saved files. Dorothy had been recording Frank and Patricia for months, documenting conversations that revealed the true depth of their callousness. I drove to a 24-hour diner and ordered coffee I didn't want needing a public space where I could listen to these recordings without falling apart in private. The first file was dated 6 months before Dorothy's death, and Frank's voice emerged from the tiny speaker with startling clarity. "We need to speed this up," Frank was saying. "The old woman is getting suspicious about the business transfers, and that investigator she hired is asking too many questions." Patricia's voice was equally cold. "Dr. Kim wants to reduce her medication, says the antihistamines might be causing her confusion. We need a different approach. What about increasing the dosage just temporarily until we can get her declared incompetent and move to assisted living? Frank, we're talking about potentially killing her. The doses we're using are already dangerous for someone her age. She's 84 years old. Everyone expects elderly people to decline rapidly. A little confusion, some falls, maybe pneumonia from weakened immunity, it all looks natural. The casual way they discussed murdering Dorothy made my hands shake so violently I could barely hold the device. These weren't desperate people making impulsive decisions. They were calculating killers planning Dorothy's death while pretending to be her devoted caregivers. The next recording was even more disturbing. Frank and Patricia discussing their long-term plans for my future, recorded just 2 weeks before Dorothy died. "Once the old lady is gone, we need Nellie to disappear completely," Frank said. "She's asking too many questions about family history, and she's smart enough to eventually piece things together." "How do we make her disappear without raising suspicions?" "Tell her she's adopted, that she gets nothing from our family. Make her feel unwanted and ashamed. Young people like that usually move far away and never look back. Problem solved." "What if she doesn't leave town? What if she tries to investigate Dorothy's death?" "Nazamin na maindaris." Frank's laugh was genuinely chilling. "Then we arrange for her to have an accident. Make it look like depression over losing her job or relationship troubles. Nursing students are under tremendous stress, and suicide rates are high in medical fields. They'd been planning to drive me away through emotional abuse, and if that failed, they were prepared to kill me too. The family that had raised me, fed me, sent me to school had spent months planning my potential murder, as casually as they might plan a vacation. But the most devastating recording came next. Patricia talking to someone on the phone, her voice filled with excitement rather than grief. "Jake, honey, Dorothy finally died last night. Yes, I know it's sad, but this means your college fund is secure now. We won't have to worry about her changing her will again or leaving everything to that adopted brat." Jake's voice was barely audible through the phone, but his response was clear enough. "Good. I was getting tired of pretending to care about some old lady who smelled like medicine. When do we find out how much money she left us?" "Frank's meeting with the attorney tomorrow. We should inherit the house, the business assets, and whatever cash she had left after her medical expenses. Probably close to $3 million total." "What about Nellie? Does she get anything?" "Not a penny. Dorothy was getting senile toward the end, but she wasn't stupid enough to leave family money to someone who's not really family. Nellie can figure out her own future now that she's graduated." The conversation continued with Patricia and Jake, planning how to spend Dorothy's money, discussing renovations to their house, a new car for Jake, and an expensive vacation to celebrate their inheritance. They were dividing up Dorothy's estate before her body was even cold, and neither expressed a moment of genuine grief for the woman who'd loved them despite their cruelty. But Dorothy had saved the most damaging recording for last. Frank on the phone with someone whose voice I didn't recognize, discussing the money laundering operation in detail. "Ricardo, we need to shut down the Morrison account for a few months after the old lady dies. There'll be too much scrutiny during estate settlement, and we can't risk anyone discovering the phantom contracts." "What about our arrangement? We've got $200,000 that needs cleaning before the end of the month." "Use the Henderson account temporarily. Patricia's got power of attorney for her Aunt Martha, and that old woman never checks her statements. We can run your money through her landscaping contracts until the Morrison estate settles." "Frank, if any of this comes back to us, you know what happens to people who compromise our operations." "Relax. The only person who could have exposed us was Dorothy, and she's not going to be a problem much longer. The investigator she hired doesn't have enough evidence for criminal charges, and once we inherit her assets, any financial irregularities become our family business." The recording ended with Frank arranging to meet Ricardo at a location I recognized as the storage facility, where Dorothy's investigator had photographed their previous exchanges. They were discussing ongoing criminal activities while planning Dorothy's death, treating her murder as a simple business problem to be solved. I sat in that diner until dawn, listening to recordings that documented months of premeditated elder abuse, planned murder, and casual discussions of my own potential death. The people who'd raised me weren't just criminals. They were sociopaths who viewed human lives as obstacles to their financial goals. But Dorothy had given me more than evidence of their crimes. She'd given me recordings that proved Frank and Patricia were ongoing threats to other elderly victims, that their criminal activities extended far beyond our family, and that they would continue hurting innocent people unless they were stopped permanently. Martha Henderson was probably Patricia's next victim, an elderly aunt with no close family oversight, perfect for the same financial manipulation they'd used against Dorothy. How many other elderly relatives were Frank and Patricia targeting while presenting themselves as helpful family members? I drove to Walsh's office as soon as it opened, carrying Dorothy's evidence and a decision that had crystallized during those dark hours in the diner. Frank and Patricia had forfeited any right to mercy when they discussed murdering Dorothy and planning my own death as backup strategies. I want them prosecuted to the full extent of the law, I told Walsh, placing the recording device on his desk. No plea bargains, no reduced sentences, no opportunities for redemption. Dorothy died gathering this evidence to protect other people from suffering the same fate. I won't dishonor her sacrifice by showing mercy to her killers. Walsh listened to selected recordings with increasing amazement, making notes and occasionally shaking his head in disgust. This is far more extensive than we realized. The money laundering operation, the threats against other family members, the premeditated nature of Dorothy's murder. It's enough evidence to ensure they spend the rest of their lives in prison. What about Jake? He clearly knew Dorothy was being poisoned and didn't report it. Accessory to elder abuse and murder conspiracy at minimum. He's 19, legally an adult, and these recordings prove he was actively participating in planning crimes against family members. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of peace settling over my shoulders. Dorothy had spent her final months ensuring that justice would eventually be served, and now I had the power to honor her sacrifice by protecting future victims from Frank and Patricia's predatory behavior. There's one more thing, Walsh said, his expression becoming almost sympathetic. Dorothy arranged for you to meet Sarah Morrison next week if you're ready. She's been waiting 28 years to hold her daughter again. 28 years of separation based on lies and threats from people who'd claimed to love us both. Sarah had been mourning a daughter who'd been alive and growing up 30 minutes away, while I'd been wondering why I felt so disconnected from the people who'd claimed to be my parents. I'm ready, I said firmly, but first I want to watch Frank and Patricia's world collapse around them. They took everything from Dorothy, from Sarah, from me. Now it's time for them to lose everything they stole. Detective Maria Santos met me at a coffee shop downtown carrying a briefcase that contained 2 years of surveillance documentation on Frank's criminal enterprise. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings automatically. Dorothy Morrison was one of the most determined clients I've ever worked with, Santos said, settling into a corner booth where we could speak privately. She hired me to investigate financial irregularities, but what we discovered was a sophisticated criminal operation targeting elderly victims throughout the county. Santos opened her briefcase and removed dozens of photographs showing Frank meeting with the same group of men at various locations over many months. Your adoptive father has been laundering money for a drug distribution network run by Ricardo Martinez and his associates. Conservative estimate they've cleaned approximately $600,000 through Frank's landscaping business over the past 3 years. The photos were taken with telephoto lenses, showing Frank's face clearly as he accepted envelopes, loaded unmarked boxes, and conducted transactions that had nothing to do with legitimate landscaping services. In several images, Patricia was visible in their car, obviously serving as a lookout while Frank conducted illegal business. How does the money laundering work? Frank created multiple shell companies that supposedly provide landscaping services to commercial clients. Martinez's organization pays these fake companies for services never performed. Then Frank withdraws the money as legitimate business income after taking a 20% fee. Santos showed me invoices for landscaping work allegedly performed at addresses that turned out to be empty lots, abandoned buildings, and non-existent businesses. Frank had been generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent income while maintaining the appearance of a successful small business owner. But the drug money laundering is just part of his operation. Frank has been systematically targeting elderly clients for financial fraud, using the same methods he used against Dorothy. The detectives' files contained evidence of Frank approaching at least 7 elderly clients over the past 5 years, always following the same pattern. He'd offer to help manage their landscaping needs, build trust through reliable service, then gradually convince them he could help manage other aspects of their finances. Martha Henderson. Patricia's 79-year-old aunt signed power of attorney papers 6 months ago, Santos explained. Frank convinced her that he could help protect her from financial scams by managing her banking and investment accounts. The surveillance photos showed Frank visiting Martha twice weekly, always carrying a briefcase and staying for exactly 30 minutes. He's using the same approach he used with Dorothy, antihistamine drugs mixed into food or beverages, to create confusion, then presenting financial documents for signature while she's mentally impaired. How much has he stolen from Martha? Approximately $80,000 so far, but he's just getting started. Martha owns her house, outright has substantial savings, and receives Social Security plus pension income. She's worth about $400,000 total, all of it vulnerable to Frank's manipulation. Santos showed me bank records obtained through legal channels that documented regular transfers from Martha's accounts to Frank's various business entities. Martha believes she's investing in his landscaping company to help support Patricia's family during difficult financial times. The cruelty was staggering. Frank was stealing from Patricia's own elderly relatives while convincing them they were helping support family members in need. Martha probably felt good about her investments in Frank's business, not realizing she was funding his criminal lifestyle. There are 5 other elderly victims. Santos continued spreading out additional files. Robert Chen, 81, a widower with no children. Frank has stolen $60,000 using fake medical emergency stories that required immediate financial assistance. The files documented Frank's sophisticated manipulation techniques, fake medical bills for family emergencies, manufactured crises, requiring immediate cash assistance investment opportunities that sounded legitimate but funneled money directly into his accounts. Dorothy suspected Frank was targeting other elderly people, but she didn't realize the full scope of his operations until the final month of her life. That's when she asked me to expand the investigation beyond just her own situation. Santos had documented Frank's activities across multiple counties, working with elderly victims who lived too far apart to compare stories or recognize patterns. He'd been operating a multi-jurisdictional fraud ring while maintaining his reputation as a helpful young man who assisted elderly neighbors with various needs. The most disturbing aspect is how he selects victims. Frank specifically targets elderly people who've recently lost spouses, have no children living nearby, or have family members who rarely visit. He preys on loneliness and vulnerability. Each victim file contained heartbreaking details. Widows who welcomed Frank's visits because they provided human contact and conversation. Elderly men who'd trusted Frank to help with financial matters because they felt overwhelmed managing alone after decades of marriage. Frank's not just stealing money, I realized. He's destroying these people's ability to trust anyone ever again. Exactly. Even victims who eventually discover the theft often don't report it because they feel ashamed of being manipulated. Frank has destroyed the financial security of at least 12 elderly people, and most of them blame themselves for being foolish enough to trust him. Santos showed me photographs of Frank visiting an assisted living facility where several residents had become his victims. He presents himself as a grandson figure to elderly people who rarely receive visitors. The staff thinks he's wonderfully devoted to these elderly friends, when actually he's systematically robbing them. The scope of Frank's predatory behavior was overwhelming. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was a carefully planned operation designed to exploit the most vulnerable members of our community, while maintaining his reputation as a caring, helpful young man. What evidence do you have that would hold up in federal court? Santos smiled grimly. 2 years of surveillance footage, financial records obtained through legal channels, recorded conversations between Frank and Martinez's organization, testimony from elderly victims who've agreed to cooperate with prosecution, and documentation of the money laundering operation. She handed me a thumb drive containing digitized copies of all evidence. Dorothy paid for this investigation to continue after her death. She wanted to make sure every victim received justice, and Frank's entire operation was exposed publicly. Will the elderly victims testify against Frank? 6 of them have agreed to cooperate fully. They're angry about being victimized, but they're more angry that Frank is still targeting other elderly people. Martha Henderson was particularly motivated to help after learning that Frank had been drugging her tea during financial meetings. I thought about Dorothy's final months fighting through drug-induced confusion while trying to protect people she'd never met from suffering the same betrayal. She died knowing Frank was still operating, still targeting vulnerable elderly victims, still destroying lives for financial gain. When can we move forward with arrests? Federal agents are ready to move as soon as you give the word. Dorothy's will required that you be given the opportunity to confront Frank and Patricia privately before criminal charges were filed, but that deadline expires in 72 hours. I studied the photographs of Frank conducting drug deals while maintaining his facade as a respectable business owner of elderly victims who trusted him with their financial security, and paid dearly for that trust of Patricia, serving as his accomplice, while presenting herself as a caring daughter and aunt. Dorothy had given me the choice between private justice and public prosecution, but after seeing the full scope of Frank and Patricia's crimes, the decision was obvious. They were ongoing threats to innocent people, and showing them mercy would only enable future victimization. Schedule the arrests, I said firmly. I want them in federal custody before they can target anyone else. Santos nodded approvingly. Dorothy would be proud. She spent her final weeks making sure Frank and Patricia would face consequences for every person they'd hurt. As I drove home with Santos's evidence files, I realized Dorothy had given me something more valuable than an inheritance. She'd given me the power to protect elderly victims I'd never meet from suffering the same betrayal that had defined her final years. Frank and Patricia's predatory operation was about to end permanently, and every elderly person in our community would be safer because Dorothy Morrison had refused to die quietly. Walsh's office felt like a war room as we planned the confrontation that would determine Frank and Patricia's fate. Santos had arranged for federal agents to be positioned nearby, ready to make arrests if Frank and Patricia refused to cooperate. But Dorothy's will required offering them one final opportunity to confess and make amends. The confrontation needs to happen at their house. Walsh explained in front of family witnesses who can testify later that they were given every opportunity to explain their actions voluntarily. I'd called Frank's sister, Carol, and brother Robert, Dorothy's other children who lived across the country and rarely visited. They'd agreed to fly in for what I described as an important family meeting about Dorothy's estate and some concerning financial discrepancies. They don't know about Frank's crimes yet, I asked Walsh. Dorothy wanted them to hear the truth directly from Frank and Patricia if possible. She believed family members deserved the chance to understand how their mother actually died before reading about it in criminal indictments. Carol and Robert had loved Dorothy dearly but trusted Frank and Patricia to manage her care because of geographic distance and their own busy professional lives. Learning that their mother had been systematically poisoned and financially exploited would devastate them, but they needed to know the truth. What exactly are we offering Frank and Patricia? Walsh consulted Dorothy's detailed instructions. Full confession to all crimes, complete financial restitution, to every victim public apology, acknowledging their abuse of Dorothy and other elderly victims, and cooperation with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences rather than maximum penalties. And if they refuse, immediate arrest, seizure of all assets, criminal charges carrying potential life sentences, and civil lawsuits that will destroy them financially, even if they avoid lengthy prison terms. Dorothy had structured her final offer carefully. Frank and Patricia could choose between accepting responsibility and maintaining some dignity or facing complete destruction through criminal prosecution that would expose every detail of their predatory operation. Santos had coordinated with federal agents to ensure Frank couldn't destroy evidence or flee during the confrontation. His phones are monitored, his bank accounts are flagged, and surveillance teams are positioned at every location where he might attempt to dispose of incriminating materials. What about Jake? He's 19 and legally an adult who participated in planning crimes against family members, Walsh said firmly. Dorothy's mercy extends only to Frank and Patricia. Jake faces full prosecution unless he voluntarily testifies against his parents and cooperates completely with investigators. I thought about Jake filming my emotional breakdown after learning about the adoption posting videos of my pain for social media entertainment, while knowing his family had been systematically stealing from Dorothy. His cruelty had been casual and constant, and he deserved to face consequences for participating in elder abuse. I want to record the entire confrontation, I said. If they confess, I want their admissions documented. If they deny everything, I want their lies preserved for the jury trial. Walsh nodded approvingly. Dorothy anticipated that request. She purchased professional recording equipment specifically for this meeting, and state law allows recording conversations in your own home with proper notice. We spent 2 hours reviewing exactly what evidence to present and in what order. The adoption papers and family relationship revelations, first followed by business fraud documentation, then the recordings of Frank and Patricia planning Dorothy's murder. The sequence was designed to give them multiple opportunities to confess before presenting the most damaging evidence. Remember, Santos cautioned, Frank has been involved with dangerous criminals for several years. If he realizes he's facing life in prison, he might become desperate enough to attempt violence. That's why federal agents will be positioned outside the house, Walsh added. Any sign of aggressive behavior, and they'll intervene immediately. I studied the pile of evidence that represented Dorothy's final 2 years of life. She'd spent her remaining time and energy gathering proof of Frank and Patricia's crimes, sacrificing her own health and safety to protect future victims from their predatory behavior. There's something else you should know, Walsh said quietly. Dorothy included a personal message for Frank and Patricia in her will. She wanted them to understand exactly how their actions affected her final months. He handed me an envelope sealed with Dorothy's distinctive handwriting to Frank and Patricia Morrison from the woman whose love you turned into a weapon against innocent people. Should I read this now? Dorothy wanted it read aloud during the confrontation after they've been presented with evidence of their crimes. She wanted her voice to be part of this meeting, even though she couldn't be here in person. The weight of Dorothy's trust settled on my shoulders like a familiar blanket. She'd spent her final months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence and planning strategies to ensure Frank and Patricia faced consequences for decades of systematic cruelty. I'm ready, I said firmly. When do we confront them? Tomorrow evening. Carol and Robert arrive at 3 o'clock and the family meeting is scheduled for 6. Frank and Patricia think they're attending a routine estate discussion about dividing Dorothy's assets. They have no idea what's coming. Santos smiled grimly. They're expecting to learn about their inheritance. Instead, they're going to discover they've been under federal investigation for 2 years and face immediate arrest unless they confess to multiple felonies. I spent that night in Dorothy's house surrounded by the evidence of her love and determination. Her furniture, her books, her carefully maintained garden, all of it testament to a life spent caring for others despite receiving cruelty in return. Dorothy had given me the power to choose between mercy and justice, between private resolution and public prosecution. But after reviewing 2 years of evidence documenting Frank and Patricia's predatory behavior, the choice was clear. They'd forfeited any right to mercy when they decided to murder an elderly woman rather than stop stealing from her. Tomorrow evening, Frank and Patricia Morrison would finally face consequences for 28 years of systematic abuse. Dorothy Morrison would finally receive justice. The Morrison family house buzzed with tension, disguised as normalcy, when Carol and Robert arrived for what they believed was a routine estate meeting. Frank had prepared coffee, and Patricia had arranged cookies on her best china, both of them playing perfect hosts while having no idea their entire world was about to collapse. Carol looked exactly like Dorothy had at 60, with the same silver hair and determined jawline. Robert shared Dorothy's gentle eyes but carried himself with the confidence of a successful businessman accustomed to handling family finances. Both of them had flown across the country to honor their mother's memory and settle her affairs responsibly. "Nellie, you look wonderful," Carol said, embracing me warmly. "Dorothy was so proud when you graduated from nursing school. She talked about it for weeks." Frank's expression tightened slightly at the mention of Dorothy discussing my achievements. Mother was getting confused toward the end. She sometimes forgot which grandchildren had accomplished what. "That's strange," Robert said thoughtfully. "When I talked to her 2 weeks before she died, she seemed perfectly sharp. Mentioned Nellie's graduation specifically and how excited she was about the hospital job." Patricia quickly changed the subject. "Should we get started? I know you both have flights tomorrow evening, and there's quite a bit to discuss about the estate settlement." Walsh arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, carrying his briefcase and wearing an expression of professional solemnity. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for gathering to address these important family matters." Frank extended his hand confidently. "Mr. Walsh, I assume you have Dorothy's will, and the estate documents. Patricia and I are ready to handle whatever needs to be done. Actually, there have been some significant developments regarding Dorothy's estate that everyone needs to understand before we proceed with any settlements." Walsh opened his briefcase and removed the first stack of documents. "These are adoption papers for Nellie Morrison, finalized 28 years ago when she was 3 years old." Carol gasped, reaching for the papers. "Nellie was adopted, Frank. Patricia. Why didn't you ever mention this?" "It was a private family matter," Frank said defensively. "We didn't see any reason to make it public information." "The biological mother is listed as Sarah Elizabeth Morrison," Walsh continued. "Dorothy's daughter Sarah, who disappeared after giving birth 29 years ago." The silence in the room was deafening. Robert studied the adoption papers with increasing amazement, while Carol stared at Frank and Patricia in shock. "Sarah had a baby," Carol whispered. "Our sister Sarah had a daughter and nobody told us?" Patricia's voice was barely audible. "It was complicated. Sarah was in trouble with dangerous people, and we thought it was safer if fewer people knew about Nellie's connection to our family." "Safer for who?" Robert's voice was getting louder. "Sarah's been missing for almost 30 years, and you've been raising her daughter without telling anyone in the family about the connection." Walsh waited for the initial shock to settle before presenting the business fraud documentation. "There's more. These financial records show systematic theft from Dorothy's estate over the past 5 years. Frank's face went completely white as Walsh spread out bank statements, forged documents, and transfer records documenting the theft of Dorothy's landscaping business. Frank has been using power of attorney privileges to transfer Dorothy's business assets to his own company, Walsh explained. The total theft amounts to approximately $400,000 in equipment contracts and client relationships. "That's impossible," Frank stammered. "Mother gave me permission to manage the business operations. Everything was done with her knowledge and consent." "Really? Then perhaps you can explain these recordings." Walsh played the audio of Frank and Patricia discussing drugging Dorothy's tea to make her appear mentally incompetent during financial discussions. Carol and Robert listened in horrified silence as Frank's voice described their mother as getting suspicious and needing increased dosage to maintain compliance. "You were poisoning our mother!" Carol's voice broke completely. "You were drugging her to steal her money." Patricia burst into tears. "It wasn't supposed to hurt her. We just needed her to trust our judgment about financial matters. She was getting paranoid about the business transfers." Paranoid. Robert stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "She was right to be suspicious. You were systematically robbing her." Santos appeared in the doorway, her badge visible as she entered uninvited. "Frank Morrison, Patricia Morrison. I'm Detective Santos. You're both under arrest for elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder." Frank bolted toward the back door, but federal agents were already positioned in the yard. He was tackled on the patio while neighbors gathered to watch the spectacle cell phones recording as he screamed threats at everyone present. Patricia fainted when Santos read their Miranda rights, and Jake emerged from his bedroom in time to see his father handcuffed and dragged away by federal agents. The family gathering had become a crime scene in less than 30 minutes. Carol was sobbing over the recordings of Frank and Patricia planning Dorothy's death, while Robert demanded to know how long Santos had been investigating their mother's murder. 2 years, Santos replied. "Dorothy hired me when she suspected financial irregularities. We've been documenting systematic elder abuse and money laundering operations targeting multiple victims." Money laundering. Jake's voice was shrill with panic. "What does that mean for my college fund?" "Your college fund was generated through criminal activities," Walsh explained calmly. "All assets purchased with illegal proceeds will be seized and returned to victims." Jake collapsed into a chair, finally understanding that his privileged lifestyle had been built on stolen money and that his parents' crimes would destroy his future along with their own. The house filled with law enforcement officials as agents executed search warrants, seizing computers, financial records, and evidence of Frank's drug money laundering operation. Neighbors gathered on the street, watching in shock as the family they'd respected for decades was exposed as criminal predators. Carol and Robert were devastated, but determined to cooperate fully with the investigation. "Our mother died believing her own children were stealing from her," Carol said through her tears. "She died alone and afraid because we trusted Frank and Patricia to care for her properly." But the most powerful moment came when Walsh played Dorothy's final recording for the assembled family. Her voice clear and strong, despite her failing health, speaking directly to Frank and Patricia 3 weeks before her death. "You've taken my business, my money, my health, and my peace of mind, but you will not take my granddaughter's future or my family's legacy. I've spent my final months ensuring that justice will be served, that other elderly people will be protected from your predatory behavior, and that Nellie will finally learn the truth about her family." The recording continued. "Frank and Patricia, you chose to turn my love into a weapon against innocent people. You used my trust to facilitate crimes against vulnerable victims. You destroyed my relationship with my granddaughter and contributed to my daughter's 28-year disappearance. But love is stronger than cruelty. Truth is more powerful than lies, and justice will ultimately prevail even when good people die fighting for it." As federal agents led Frank and Patricia away in separate cars, the family they'd manipulated for decades watched from the front porch. Carol and Robert were already planning to attend every court hearing, determined to see their mother's killers face full consequences for their crimes. Jake sat alone in his empty house, surrounded by possessions purchased with stolen money, finally understanding that his parents' love had always been conditional on their criminal success. Dorothy Morrison's final family gathering had ended exactly as she'd planned. Truth had been exposed, justice was being served, and the predatory operation that had destroyed so many elderly lives was finally coming to an end. The arrest of Frank and Patricia Morrison made front-page news across 3 counties, but the true scope of their criminal enterprise only became clear as federal investigators executed simultaneous search warrants at dozens of locations. I watched the morning news from Dorothy's kitchen, drinking coffee from her favorite mug, while reporters described the sophisticated elder abuse ring that had operated undetected for nearly a decade. FBI agents raided 6 storage facilities, 2 bank branches, and the offices of Riverside Landscaping in coordinated operations beginning at dawn, the reporter announced. Sources close to the investigation described this as one of the largest elder abuse cases in state history, with potential victims numbering in the dozens. The television footage showed Frank being arrested at his business while desperately feeding documents into an industrial shredder. Federal agents had burst through the doors just as he was destroying financial records that could have implicated additional victims or criminal associates. Patricia's arrest was even more dramatic. She'd been found in her car at a pharmacy parking lot with an empty bottle of sleeping pills slumped over the steering wheel with a suicide note claiming she couldn't live with the shame of what we'd done to innocent people. The paramedics had pumped her stomach and stabilized her condition, but the suicide attempt generated a media frenzy that portrayed her as overwhelmed by guilt rather than someone trying to escape prosecution for systematic crimes. Patricia Morrison remains hospitalized under police guard, the reporter continued. Her suicide note allegedly contains confessions to multiple felonies and identifies additional elderly victims who haven't yet been contacted by authorities. Jake's arrest happened at his college dormitory where federal agents found him frantically transferring money from accounts linked to his parents' criminal activities. His roommates recorded the entire scene for social media, and within hours, videos of Jake crying and pleading his innocence were viral across multiple platforms. "I didn't know the money was stolen," Jake sobbed to anyone who would listen. "My parents told me they were successful business owners. I had no idea they were criminals." But Santos had recordings of Jake participating in conversations about drugging Dorothy and planning my own potential elimination if I became too curious about family finances. His claims of innocence wouldn't survive contact with actual evidence. Walsh called me around noon with updates from the federal task force. Frank's business contained evidence of money laundering operations totaling over $1.2 million. He was cleaning drug money for 3 separate criminal organizations while simultaneously defrauding elderly clients. How many elderly victims have they identified? 15 confirmed so far, with potential additional victims in surrounding counties. The youngest victim was 67. The oldest was 91. Total theft amounts are still being calculated, but preliminary estimates suggest over $2 million in stolen assets. The scope was staggering. Frank and Patricia hadn't just targeted a few isolated elderly people. They'd been operating a systematic predatory enterprise that destroyed dozens of families while generating substantial illegal profits. Martha Henderson was found unconscious in her home this morning, Walsh continued. She'd been given a massive overdose of antihistamines, apparently because Frank was worried she might talk to investigators. Is she going to survive? She's stable but confused. Frank had been drugging her heavily for weeks, preparing to have her declared mentally incompetent so he could gain complete control of her assets. If we'd waited another month to make arrests, she'd probably be dead. The thought that Frank had been actively planning additional murders while under investigation was terrifying. How many elderly people had died mysterious deaths after refusing Frank's financial assistance or becoming suspicious of his motives? There's something else. Walsh said, his voice becoming more serious. Frank's criminal associates are not pleased about losing their money laundering operation. Ricardo Martinez and his organization are facing significant financial losses because of Frank's arrest. Are they threatening retaliation? Federal marshals are providing security for you, Carol Robert, and other family members who testified against Frank. These aren't people who accept business disruptions quietly. Santos arrived at Dorothy's house that afternoon with boxes of evidence that painted an even darker picture of Frank's criminal activities. "We found detailed files on elderly victims dating back 8 years," she explained. "Frank kept meticulous records of each person's financial situation, family relationships, and vulnerability factors. The files were organized like a predator's hunting guide. Frank had researched elderly people's social isolation, health problems, and family dynamics before selecting targets for financial manipulation. Robert Chen lost his life savings because Frank convinced him to invest in fake medical research, supposedly being conducted for his late wife's cancer type. Mrs. Eleanor Davis signed over her house deed because Frank claimed he needed collateral to secure a business loan for Patricia's fictional medical emergency. Each victim file contained heartbreaking details of emotional manipulation designed to exploit grief, loneliness, and family loyalty. Frank had turned elderly people's love for their families into weapons against their own financial security. The most disturbing discovery was Frank's backup plan for troublesome victims. Santos continued, "If elderly clients became suspicious or refused to cooperate, he'd arrange accidents or medical emergencies that appeared natural." "You mean he was murdering people?" 3 elderly clients died under suspicious circumstances after questioning Frank's financial management. Heart attacks, falls, sudden illnesses that seemed consistent with their age and health conditions. But all 3 had recently expressed concerns about missing money or strange financial transactions. Dorothy hadn't been Frank's first murder victim. She'd just been the one who'd gathered enough evidence to expose his entire operation before dying. How many other elderly people had Frank killed to protect his criminal enterprise? Patricia's suicide note contained detailed confessions about the murder methods, Santos explained. They'd researched drug interactions that could cause heart failure in elderly people, studied fall patterns that would appear accidental, and learned about medication dosages that could simulate natural death. Frank and Patricia had been serial killers disguised as helpful family members, systematically murdering elderly people who threatened their criminal operations while maintaining reputations as caring, devoted relatives. The federal investigation revealed bank accounts in multiple states' property purchases, funded with stolen money, and evidence that Frank had been recruiting other young men to operate similar elderly fraud schemes in distant counties. "This wasn't just a local operation," Walsh explained during an evening briefing. Frank was building a franchise model for elder abuse, teaching other criminals how to target vulnerable elderly people in communities where they wouldn't be suspected. The true scope of Frank and Patricia's criminal enterprise was beyond anything Dorothy had imagined when she'd first hired Santos to investigate missing money. They'd been operating a sophisticated network of predatory criminals who viewed elderly people as renewable resources to be harvested for financial gain. But Dorothy's evidence had provided federal investigators with everything needed to dismantle the entire operation. Her careful documentation, combined with Santos's surveillance and the cooperation of surviving victims, was ensuring that Frank and Patricia faced federal charges carrying potential life sentences. "The sentencing hearing is scheduled for next month," Walsh informed me. "Frank's attorney is attempting to negotiate a plea deal, but federal prosecutors are demanding full sentences given the scope of the crimes and ongoing threat to community safety." "What about the money they stole? Can victims recover their losses?" "Dorothy's $5 million inheritance to you comes with a provision requiring you to establish a victim compensation fund. She wanted stolen money returned to every elderly person Frank and Patricia victimized, even if it meant reducing your inheritance significantly." I thought about Dorothy's final letter, her determination to protect people she'd never met from suffering the same betrayal she'd experienced. Even in death, she was ensuring that Frank and Patricia's victims received justice and compensation for their losses. "Use whatever money is necessary to make victims whole again," I said without hesitation. "Dorothy died fighting for those people. I won't dishonor her sacrifice by prioritizing my inheritance over their recovery." Walsh smiled approvingly. "Dorothy knew you'd make that choice. She was very proud of your character and integrity despite everything Frank and Patricia did to try to damage your spirit. As evening fell, I walked through Dorothy's garden surrounded by flowers she'd planted and tended during her final months while fighting Frank and Patricia's systematic abuse. Her roses were blooming beautifully, testament to her determination to create beauty even while battling evil. Tomorrow, Frank and Patricia would face federal charges that could result in life sentences. Their predatory operation was destroyed, their victims would receive compensation, and their criminal associates were under investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies. Dorothy Morrison had died believing justice would eventually be served, and her faith was finally being vindicated through the federal court system. The federal courthouse buzzed with activity as Frank and Patricia Morrison's case dominated headlines across multiple states. Media outlets had discovered that their elder abuse operation had crossed state lines, making it a federal case with implications for elderly protection laws nationwide. Patricia's suicide attempt had backfired spectacularly. Instead of generating sympathy, her detailed confession note had provided prosecutors with evidence of premeditated murder that made plea negotiations impossible. Patricia admitted to poisoning 3 elderly clients who became suspicious of Frank's financial management. Prosecutor Janet Williams explained during a pre-trial meeting. She described specific drug dosages, timing of administration, and methods used to make the deaths appear natural. The confession note had been Patricia's attempt to blame everything on Frank while portraying herself as a reluctant accomplice who'd been coerced into participating. Instead, it provided detailed evidence of her central role in planning and executing multiple murders. Frank's legal strategy collapsed completely when his attorney tried to argue that Patricia had manipulated him into criminal activities. Prosecutor Williams simply played Dorothy's recordings of Frank threatening to kill elderly clients who refused to cooperate with his financial schemes. Frank Morrison was the architect of this criminal enterprise, Williams announced to the packed courtroom. He recruited accomplices, selected victims, planned murders, and coordinated with drug dealers to launder money through accounts belonging to elderly victims. The trial attracted national attention as details of the elder abuse operation emerged through witness testimony. Martha Henderson, now recovered from her near-fatal overdose, testified about Frank's systematic manipulation and gradual theft of her life savings. "He seemed like such a caring young man," Martha told the jury, her voice breaking. "He'd bring me flowers, help with yard work, and spend hours listening to stories about my late husband. I trusted him completely because he made me feel valued and cared for." Martha's testimony was devastating because it revealed Frank's sophisticated emotional manipulation techniques. He'd spent months building trust and affection before beginning financial theft, making elderly victims feel grateful for his attention while he systematically robbed them. Robert Chen's daughter flew in from California to testify about her father's final months. Dad was convinced he was helping fund medical research that might save other families from losing loved ones to cancer. Frank had convinced him that investing his savings in this research would honor my mother's memory. Each victim's story followed the same pattern: Frank identifying vulnerability, building trust, creating emotional bonds, then exploiting those relationships to facilitate systematic theft. He'd turned elderly people's love and trust into weapons against their own financial security. But the most damaging testimony came from Ricardo Martinez, Frank's money laundering partner, who agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. "Frank approached us about cleaning drug money through his landscaping business," Martinez testified. "He said he had access to elderly clients who wouldn't question unusual financial transactions because he managed their accounts." Martinez described Frank as enthusiastic about expanding the money laundering operation, suggesting they could use elderly clients' accounts to clean larger amounts of drug proceeds while simultaneously stealing from the account holders. Frank said elderly people were perfect victims because they often died before discovering financial irregularities, and their families rarely examined estate finances carefully enough to detect sophisticated theft. The callous calculation in Frank's approach was breathtaking. He'd viewed elderly people as disposable resources whose deaths would conveniently conceal his crimes. Patricia's attorney attempted to portray her as another victim of Frank's manipulation, but Prosecutor Williams systematically destroyed that narrative with evidence of Patricia's independent criminal activities. Patricia Morrison operated her own elderly abuse scheme, targeting her relatives, while Frank focused on non-family victims. Williams explained to the jury, she convinced her Aunt Martha to sign over power of attorney, then use that access to steal thousands of dollars while simultaneously drugging Martha to prevent detection. Patricia had also been recruiting elderly women from her church to participate in fake investment schemes that funneled money directly into accounts she controlled. Her victims trusted her because of their shared faith and a reputation as a devoted daughter, caring for her elderly mother. Jake's testimony was particularly damaging to both parents. His attempt to claim innocence crumbled when prosecutors played recordings of him participating in family discussions about drugging Dorothy and planning my potential elimination. Jake Morrison was 19 years old when he suggested increasing the drug dosages given to his grandmother to make her more compliant. Williams told the jury he was an adult who chose to participate in planning the murder of an elderly family member. Jake's social media posts provided additional evidence of his involvement and attitude toward the crimes. Posts celebrating expensive purchases, vacation trips, and lifestyle luxuries that were clearly beyond his parents' legitimate income, all accompanied by jokes about old people being too stupid to manage their own money. The federal case attracted attention from elderly advocacy groups nationwide who viewed Frank and Patricia's prosecution as a test of the justice system's commitment to protecting vulnerable seniors from financial predators. This case demonstrates the sophisticated methods criminals use to exploit elderly victims, testified Dr. Sarah Williams from the National Elder Abuse Prevention Center. Frank and Patricia Morrison represent a growing threat to elderly Americans who face increasingly complex financial manipulation schemes. The defense attorney's final strategy was to argue that Frank and Patricia's actions were motivated by financial desperation rather than callous greed, hoping to generate sympathy from jurors who might understand economic pressures. That argument collapsed when prosecutors revealed bank records showing Frank and Patricia had accumulated over $3 million in assets while claiming financial hardship to justify stealing from elderly victims. Financial desperation doesn't explain why defendants purchase luxury cars, expensive jewelry, and vacation properties, while simultaneously claiming they needed to steal from elderly relatives to pay basic living expenses, Prosecutor Williams observed. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges: conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, money laundering, wire fraud, and racketeering. Frank's face went completely white when the verdicts were read, while Patricia collapsed sobbing in her attorney's arms. Jake received a separate guilty verdict on charges of conspiracy and accessory to murder, ensuring he'd face significant prison time despite his age and claims of manipulation by his parents. But the most satisfying moment came during victim impact statements when elderly survivors spoke directly to Frank and Patricia about the devastation their crimes had caused. "You didn't just steal my money," Martha Henderson told Frank, her voice strong despite her age. "You stole my ability to trust anyone, my sense of safety in my own home, my faith in human goodness. You turned my love for family into a weapon against my own security." Robert Chen's daughter addressed Patricia directly. "You watched my father invest his life savings in fake medical research, believing he was honoring my mother's memory. You let him die, thinking he'd contributed to saving other families from cancer, when actually you were just stealing money to fund your criminal lifestyle." As the victim statements continued, Frank and Patricia's true impact became clear. They hadn't just stolen money. They destroyed elderly people's faith in humanity while using their love and trust to facilitate systematic abuse. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, with federal prosecutors requesting maximum sentences for crimes that had terrorized elderly communities across multiple states. Dorothy Morrison's evidence had not only ensured justice for her own murder, but had exposed a sophisticated criminal enterprise that threatened elderly people throughout the region. Her final months of investigation and documentation were protecting vulnerable seniors she'd never met from suffering the same betrayal she'd experienced. The Morrison case had become a catalyst for examining elder abuse prevention throughout our region, with local media outlets investigating how Frank and Patricia had operated undetected for so many years. The stories that emerged revealed a community that had missed numerous warning signs while respecting Frank's reputation as a helpful family man. I noticed Frank visiting Mrs. Chen every Tuesday with paperwork, neighbor Helen Rodriguez told Channel 7 News. He always carried a briefcase and stayed exactly 30 minutes. I thought it was wonderful how devoted he was to helping elderly neighbors. Similar stories emerged from across the county. Frank's systematic approach to victim selection and manipulation had been hiding in plain sight, disguised as community service and family devotion. The nursing staff at Sunny Meadows Assisted Living admitted they'd never questioned Frank's regular visits to residents who had no family nearby. He brought flowers, spent time listening to their stories, and helped with paperwork they found confusing. Administrator Linda Chen explained, "We thought he was a remarkable young man who truly cared about elderly people." The facility had unknowingly provided Frank with access to vulnerable victims while praising his apparent compassion. 3 residents had lost significant money through Frank's fake investment schemes, but staff had never connected his visits with subsequent financial problems. Frank convinced our residents that he could help them manage complex financial decisions, Chen continued. They trusted him because he seemed so knowledgeable and patient with their questions. Local churches had also been infiltrated by Patricia's recruitment efforts. Pastor Michael Thompson from St. Mary's revealed that Patricia had been targeting elderly parishioners for months, convincing them to invest in fake medical charities that actually funneled money into her personal accounts. Patricia presented herself as someone trying to honor her mother's memory by supporting cancer research, Pastor Thompson explained. She showed us forged documents from legitimate medical institutions and convinced several elderly members to make substantial donations. The church community felt betrayed by Patricia's manipulation of their faith and charity. Several elderly parishioners had donated thousands of dollars, believing they were supporting legitimate medical research, only to discover their money had funded Patricia's criminal lifestyle. She prayed with us, cried with us about our own family losses, and convinced us that supporting her mother's medical research was a way to honor our own deceased relatives, explained 82-year-old parishioner Grace Martinez. She turned our grief into a weapon against our own financial security. The broader community response revealed how Frank and Patricia's reputation for helping elderly people had actually facilitated their crimes. Local businesses, social organizations, and neighborhood groups had all recommended Frank's services to elderly clients without realizing they were directing victims toward systematic predators. Frank Morrison was on our approved vendor list for elderly clients who needed landscaping services, admitted Jennifer Walsh from Senior Community Services. We referred dozens of elderly clients to his business over the past 5 years. The organization had unknowingly been feeding victims to Frank while believing they were connecting elderly clients with trustworthy service providers. Several clients had been manipulated into signing power of attorney documents after Frank convinced them he could help manage their finances more effectively. But the community response wasn't just about recognizing past mistakes. Local organizations began implementing new protection protocols designed to prevent similar elder abuse schemes. We're now requiring background checks for all service providers who work with elderly clients, Walsh announced. We're also training staff to recognize financial manipulation warning signs and establishing regular check-ins with clients who might be vulnerable to fraud. Banks throughout the region implemented new safeguards after discovering how Frank had exploited elderly clients' trust to facilitate money laundering and theft. We've created alert systems that flag unusual financial activity involving elderly account holders, explained First National Bank manager Robert Anderson. The banking protocols included mandatory waiting periods for large transactions involving elderly customers, required family notification for significant account changes, and regular financial literacy education programs designed to help elderly clients recognize manipulation attempts. Frank Morrison used our elderly clients' trust and confusion to facilitate criminal activities. Anderson continued, "We're committed to ensuring that never happens again." Local law enforcement agencies admitted they'd been unprepared for the sophisticated elder abuse schemes Frank and Patricia had employed. Traditional elder abuse usually involves family members stealing modest amounts from vulnerable relatives, explained Sheriff Patricia Williams. Frank and Patricia were operating a multi-state criminal enterprise that required federal resources to investigate and prosecute. The Sheriff's Department established new elder abuse investigation protocols, including partnerships with federal agencies and specialized training for officers responding to elderly fraud complaints. We've learned that elder abuse has evolved beyond simple family theft, Williams explained. Modern predators like Frank Morrison use sophisticated emotional manipulation and financial schemes that require specialized investigative techniques. The medical community also recognized their role in missing warning signs of systematic elder abuse. Dr. Kim, who had initially suspected Dorothy was being drugged, established new protocols for documenting and reporting suspected medication abuse in elderly patients. Dorothy Morrison's case taught us that elderly patients experiencing unexplained confusion or memory problems might be victims of deliberate poisoning rather than natural cognitive decline. Dr. Kim explained, "We now test for unexpected substances in elderly patients who show sudden mental changes." The hospital implemented mandatory elder abuse screening for all elderly patients with special attention to signs of financial exploitation and medication manipulation. But perhaps the most important community response came from elderly residents themselves, who organized support groups and education programs to help each other recognize and resist manipulation attempts. Frank Morrison succeeded because he isolated his victims and made them feel special and cared for, explained Martha Henderson, who had become a leading advocate for elder abuse prevention. "We're creating networks of mutual support so elderly people don't have to face financial decisions alone." The support groups provided elderly residents with resources for verifying financial advice, recognizing manipulation tactics, and reporting suspicious behavior before becoming victims. "Dorothy Morrison died fighting for people she'd never met," Martha continued. "The best way to honor her memory is to ensure other elderly people never experience the betrayal she suffered." Community organizations established the Dorothy Morrison Elder Protection Fund, using donations to provide free legal services for elderly fraud victims and education programs for potential targets. The fund also supported legislation requiring more stringent oversight of power of attorney arrangements and mandatory reporting of suspected elder abuse by healthcare providers, financial institutions, and social services organizations. Frank and Patricia Morrison destroyed dozens of elderly lives while our community celebrated their apparent compassion, explained Fund Coordinator Carol Morrison, Dorothy's daughter. "We're committed to ensuring that never happens again." The Morrison case had transformed local attitudes toward elder protection, creating awareness that sophisticated predators could operate within communities for years, while maintaining reputations as helpful, caring individuals. Most importantly, the community response honored Dorothy's sacrifice by creating systems to protect future elderly residents from the same systematic abuse she'd endured while fighting for justice. Her evidence had not only exposed Frank and Patricia's crimes, but had catalyzed community-wide changes that would protect vulnerable seniors for generations to come. The asset forfeiture proceedings revealed the staggering scope of Frank and Patricia's accumulated wealth, much of which had been hidden in accounts across multiple states and investment vehicles designed to conceal criminal proceeds. Federal investigators had spent months tracing money flows through shell companies, fake business entities, and offshore accounts that Frank had established to launder drug money and hide stolen assets. The total value of seized assets exceeds $4.2 million, announced federal prosecutor Janet Williams during a press conference. This includes real estate vehicles, investment accounts, business equipment, and cash held in various financial institutions. The seizures had been dramatic and comprehensive. Frank's landscaping business was dismantled completely with all equipment and vehicles sold at federal auction. The family home purchased with stolen money from elderly victims was seized and would be sold to compensate fraud victims. Jake's college fund car and personal possessions purchased with criminal proceeds were also forfeited, leaving him facing potential prison time with no financial resources for legal representation or future education. Every dollar Frank and Patricia Morrison possessed was either stolen from elderly victims or generated through money laundering activities. Williams continued, "Federal law requires that all criminal proceeds be returned to victims or used to compensate law enforcement agencies for investigation costs." But the most significant discovery was Frank's secret investment portfolio, containing over $1.8 million in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds purchased with proceeds from elderly fraud and drug money laundering. Walsh had been working with federal agencies to ensure that recovered assets were distributed fairly among Frank and Patricia's numerous victims. But the process was complicated by the fact that some victims had died before recovering their stolen money. Dorothy's will specifically addresses this situation, Walsh explained during a meeting with victim families. She established the Morrison Family Justice Fund to ensure that deceased victims' families receive compensation and that surviving victims recover their full losses. Dorothy had anticipated that Frank and Patricia's crimes extended far beyond her own situation, and she'd structured her estate to provide comprehensive victim compensation rather than personal enrichment for surviving family members. Nellie Morrison, as Dorothy's primary heir, will receive approximately $2.7 million after all victim compensation and estate expenses are paid, Walsh announced. Dorothy wanted to ensure that her great-granddaughter received financial security while prioritizing justice for elderly fraud victims. The compensation process revealed the heartbreaking scope of Frank and Patricia's impact on elderly victims and their families. Martha Henderson would recover the $80,000 Frank had stolen, plus interest and compensation for medical expenses related to her poisoning. Robert Chen's estate would receive full restitution for the $60,000 he'd lost to Frank's fake medical research scheme, ensuring that his daughter inherited the savings her father had intended to leave her. Each victim will receive 100% restitution, plus compensation for medical expenses, legal fees, and emotional suffering, Williams announced. The goal is to make victims whole while sending a message that elder abuse carries severe financial consequences for perpetrators. But recovery involved more than just money. Several victims required ongoing medical care for health problems caused by Frank and Patricia's systematic poisoning, and the Morrison Justice Fund was structured to cover those expenses indefinitely. Dorothy understood that some forms of damage can't be repaired with money alone, Walsh explained. The fund includes provisions for counseling, medical care, and support services that victims need to rebuild their lives. The fund also supported legal advocacy for elderly abuse victims, in other cases ensuring that Dorothy's evidence and fight for justice would protect vulnerable seniors beyond just Frank and Patricia's direct victims. Eleanor Davis, who had lost her house deed to Frank's manipulation, would not only recover her property, but receive assistance with legal fees and home security improvements to help her feel safe again. Frank Morrison convinced me to sign over my house as collateral for his business loan, Eleanor explained. I thought I was helping a young family during a medical emergency. Instead, I was giving my home to a criminal who viewed my kindness as weakness to exploit. The recovery process also revealed assets Frank and Patricia had hidden in Jake's name, apparently believing that money held by their teenage son would be protected from criminal seizure. Jake had unknowingly been holding over $300,000 in accounts linked to his parents' money laundering operation, all of which was forfeited to victim compensation despite his claims of innocence. Jake Morrison may not have understood the source of money in accounts bearing his name, Williams observed, but federal law doesn't distinguish between knowing and unknowing possession of criminal proceeds. The asset recovery demonstrated how thoroughly Frank and Patricia had integrated their criminal activities into every aspect of their lives. Their mortgage payments, car payments, insurance premiums, and daily living expenses had all been funded with stolen money, creating a lifestyle built entirely on elderly victimization. Frank and Patricia Morrison lived comfortably for years while their victims struggled with unexpected financial hardship. Williams noted, "Asset forfeiture ensures that crime doesn't pay literally." The most satisfying aspect of the recovery process was watching Frank and Patricia lose everything they'd stolen while their victims regained financial security. Houses purchased with stolen money were sold to compensate elderly fraud victims, luxury cars were auctioned to fund medical care for poisoning victims, and investment accounts built with criminal proceeds were distributed to families Frank and Patricia had destroyed. "Justice isn't just about prison sentences," Walsh observed. "It's about ensuring that victims recover what was stolen and that criminals forfeit everything they gained through their crimes." Dorothy's careful estate planning had ensured that her death wouldn't just expose Frank and Patricia's crimes, but would provide lasting financial support for everyone they'd victimized. The Morrison Justice Fund was structured to operate indefinitely, providing ongoing assistance to elderly abuse victims while supporting prevention programs and legal advocacy efforts. Dorothy Morrison died fighting for justice, Walsh announced at the fund's inaugural meeting. "This money will ensure her fight continues long after Frank and Patricia are imprisoned." The financial recovery had transformed Dorothy's inheritance from personal wealth into community protection, ensuring that her $5 million estate would serve justice rather than just enriching her surviving family. Most importantly, the comprehensive asset seizure sent a clear message to other potential elder abuse criminals: systematic theft from vulnerable seniors would result in complete financial destruction, not comfortable retirement funded by victim suffering. Frank and Patricia Morrison had lost everything, while their victims recovered not just money, but hope that justice could still prevail against sophisticated predators. The federal courthouse was packed beyond capacity for Frank and Patricia Morrison's sentencing hearing, with elderly victim families, community advocates, and media representatives filling every available seat. Federal marshals had implemented additional security measures due to threats from Frank's former criminal associates who blamed him for destroying their money laundering operation. Judge Margaret Reynolds, known for her tough sentences in elder abuse cases, reviewed the extensive victim impact statements before addressing the packed courtroom. "In 32 years on the federal bench, I have rarely encountered crimes that demonstrate such calculated cruelty toward the most vulnerable members of our society." Frank sat rigidly at the defense table, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the expensive suits he'd worn while operating his criminal enterprise. His attorney had advised him to express remorse during sentencing, but Frank's statement came across as self-pitying rather than genuinely apologetic. "Your Honor, I never intended for anyone to be hurt," Frank began, his voice barely audible. "I made mistakes in judgment during a difficult financial period, but I'm not the monster the prosecution has portrayed." Judge Reynolds' expression hardened as Frank continued to minimize his crimes. "Mr. Morrison, you systematically poisoned elderly victims to facilitate theft, murdered 3 people who became suspicious of your activities, and recruited your teenage son to participate in planning crimes against family members. These weren't mistakes in judgment. They were calculated acts of predatory violence." Patricia's statement was more honest but equally inadequate. She admitted to participating in elder abuse while claiming she'd been manipulated by Frank's stronger personality and threats against her disabled sister. "I know saying sorry doesn't fix the damage we've caused," Patricia sobbed, "but I want the victims and their families to know that I'm truly remorseful for the pain we've inflicted on innocent people." "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Reynolds replied sternly, "your suicide note contained detailed confessions to murdering elderly victims who threatened your criminal operation. Your remorse appears to be motivated by consequences rather than genuine empathy for your victims." The victim impact statements provided the most powerful moments of the hearing. Martha Henderson, now fully recovered from Frank's poisoning attempts, addressed both defendants with quiet dignity. "Frank and Patricia Morrison didn't just steal my money," Martha said, facing them directly. "They stole my peace of mind, my ability to trust people, and my sense of safety in my own home. They turned my loneliness into a weapon against my own security." Martha's statement continued, "But I want them to know that they failed to destroy my spirit. I'm 81 years old, and I refuse to spend my remaining years afraid of human kindness because two criminals chose to exploit elderly people's desire for companionship." Robert Chen's daughter spoke about her father's final months when he'd believed his life savings were funding cancer research that might save other families from the loss he'd experienced. "Frank Morrison convinced my father that investing in fake medical research would honor my mother's memory," she said through tears. "Dad died believing he'd contributed to something meaningful, when actually he'd just been robbed by someone who viewed his grief as an opportunity for profit." Eleanor Davis, who had lost her house deed to Frank's manipulation, demonstrated remarkable strength as she described rebuilding her life after discovering the fraud. "Frank Morrison convinced me to risk my home to help a young family during a medical emergency," Eleanor said. "He exploited my desire to help others, turning compassion into vulnerability. But I've learned that criminals like Frank succeed when good people become isolated and afraid to trust anyone." The most devastating statement came from Jake Morrison himself, who had agreed to testify against his parents in exchange for a reduced sentence. His words revealed the full scope of Frank and Patricia's corruption of their own family relationships. "My parents taught me that elderly people were weak and stupid, that taking their money was practically a public service because they couldn't manage finances properly," Jake said, his voice shaking. "I grew up believing that elderly victims deserved what happened to them because they were too trusting and naive." Jake's testimony continued. "I participated in family discussions about drugging my grandmother and potentially killing Nellie if she became too curious about our finances. I thought this was normal family problem solving because my parents had taught me that our comfort was more important than other people's lives." Judge Reynolds asked Jake directly, "Do you understand now that your parents were teaching you to become a predator who views vulnerable people as resources to be exploited?" "Yes, Your Honor, I'm ashamed of the person they raised me to become, and I'm committed to spending my life trying to make amends for the damage our family caused." The sentencing itself was swift and decisive. Frank received life in prison without possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, money laundering, and racketeering. The consecutive sentences ensured he'd never be released, regardless of appeals or future legal changes. Patricia received 40 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, reflecting her cooperation with prosecutors and her role as Frank's accomplice, rather than the primary architect of their crimes. Jake received 12 years in federal prison, followed by 10 years of supervised probation, with requirements to complete educational programs on elder abuse and perform community service with elderly protection organizations. But Judge Reynolds saved her harshest words for the sentencing conclusion. "Frank and Patricia Morrison represent the worst kind of predators, criminals who exploit society's most vulnerable members while presenting themselves as caring, helpful community members. Their crimes weren't motivated by desperation or mental illness," the judge continued. They were motivated by greed, callousness, and a fundamental belief that elderly people existed to be exploited for their financial benefit. Judge Reynolds addressed the packed courtroom directly. Let this sentence send a clear message that elder abuse will be prosecuted to the full extent of federal law, that criminals who target vulnerable seniors will forfeit their freedom permanently, and that our justice system will protect elderly Americans from predatory violence. As federal marshals led Frank and Patricia away in shackles, several elderly victims and their family members wept with relief. Martha Henderson embraced Eleanor Davis while Robert Chen's daughter thanked Dorothy's family for ensuring that justice had finally been served. Carol and Robert Morrison spoke briefly to reporters outside the courthouse, emphasizing that their mother's sacrifice had protected countless future victims from suffering similar abuse. Dorothy Morrison died gathering evidence to expose Frank and Patricia's crimes, Carol said. Today's sentences ensure that her final months of fighting for justice weren't in vain. The sentencing marked the end of a criminal enterprise that had terrorized elderly communities across multiple states, but it also represented a beginning. Dorothy's evidence had not only convicted her killers, but had created legal precedents and community awareness that would protect vulnerable seniors for years to come. Most importantly, Frank and Patricia Morrison would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison, ensuring they could never again exploit elderly people's trust and vulnerability for criminal profit. Justice had been served completely, and Dorothy Morrison's fight for elderly protection had achieved total victory. 6 months after Frank and Patricia's sentencing, I stood in Dorothy's restored garden surrounded by roses that had bloomed more beautifully than ever before. The house that had once felt empty and sad now buzzed with warmth and purpose as the headquarters of the Dorothy Morrison Elder Protection Foundation, which had grown from a simple victim compensation fund into a comprehensive advocacy organization. Walsh had called that morning with news that changed everything yet again. Nellie, I've received a call from attorney Sarah Collins in Portland. She's ready to meet her daughter whenever you're prepared for that conversation. Sarah Collins. My biological mother had been using her middle name as her surname for 28 years, hiding in plain sight while working as a pediatric nurse, just like I'd chosen to become. Dorothy's letter had mentioned that Sarah was alive, but hearing confirmation that she was waiting to reconnect felt surreal after a lifetime of believing she'd abandoned me. She's been following news coverage of Frank and Patricia's trial, Walsh continued. She wants you to know that she never stopped looking for ways to safely contact you, but Frank's threats about exposing her location to dangerous people from her past kept her afraid to reach out directly. I drove to Walsh's office with my hands shaking slightly, carrying Dorothy's letters that had mentioned Sarah's 28-year search for news about her daughter. Inside Walsh's office, a woman with graying auburn hair and my exact eyes sat nervously in the same chair where I'd first learned about Dorothy's investigation. Nellie, Sarah's voice broke slightly as she stood up, her hands reaching toward me tentatively. I've imagined this moment for so many years, but I never expected we'd meet under these circumstances. The embrace felt like coming home to a place I'd never known existed. Sarah smelled like lavender and coffee, and her hug was everything I'd unconsciously searched for in Frank and Patricia's distant affection. I'm so sorry, Sarah whispered, her tears soaking into my hair. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from Frank and Patricia. Sorry you grew up believing I didn't want you. Sorry it took Dorothy's death for us to find each other again. Tell me what really happened, I said, settling into the chair beside her. I need to understand why you disappeared and why Frank and Patricia were able to keep us apart for so long. Sarah's story unfolded slowly, interrupted by tears and long pauses as she revisited painful memories she'd spent decades trying to forget. I was 19 and involved with someone Frank knew from his legal connections. Marcus was charming and exciting, but I didn't realize he was connected to dangerous criminal activities until I was already pregnant. Sarah explained that Marcus had been involved with drug distribution networks that included some of the same people Frank would later work with in his money laundering operation. When I told Marcus about the pregnancy, he became violent, said he couldn't risk having a child that might be used against him by rival dealers or law enforcement. He gave me two choices: get rid of the baby or disappear permanently. So you ran. I hid at Dorothy's house during the pregnancy, but Marcus found out where I was staying. He threatened to hurt Dorothy, to hurt the baby, to destroy anyone who helped me unless I signed custody papers giving the baby to Frank and Patricia. Sarah's voice became bitter as she described Frank's role in facilitating Marcus's threats. Frank convinced me that signing adoption papers was the only way to keep you safe. He promised that Dorothy would be involved in raising you, that I could visit occasionally, that it was a temporary arrangement until Marcus lost interest. But it wasn't temporary. Frank used my fear of Marcus to control the situation completely. Every time I tried to contact you, Frank would remind me that Marcus was still dangerous, still looking for ways to hurt me through anyone I cared about. Sarah had spent years moving between cities, changing jobs, and avoiding any situation that might lead Marcus or his criminal associates back to her location. She'd become a pediatric nurse, partly because working with children helped fill the emotional void left by losing her own daughter. I followed your life from a distance, Sarah continued. Dorothy sent me school pictures, report cards, and updates about your achievements, always through intermediaries to avoid Frank's detection. She was protecting both of us. Dorothy never stopped fighting Frank and Patricia's control over your life. She hired private investigators to document Marcus's criminal activities, hoping to prove he was no longer a threat so I could safely return. Sarah showed me dozens of letters from Dorothy spanning 28 years, documenting my childhood achievements and expressing her determination to eventually reunite our family. Dorothy discovered that Marcus died in a drug-related shooting 6 years ago, Sarah explained. That's when she intensified her efforts to expose Frank and Patricia's crimes, knowing there was no longer any legitimate reason for me to stay hidden. Why didn't you contact me then? Frank convinced me that you were happy with your life, that revealing the truth about your adoption would only cause confusion and pain. He said you'd grown up considering Patricia your real mother and wouldn't want contact with a biological mother who'd abandoned you. Sarah's pain was visible as she described years of believing I didn't want a relationship with her, while I'd been accepting Frank and Patricia's explanations that biological family connections were unimportant. Dorothy's final letters mentioned that Frank was becoming more dangerous, that he'd threatened to arrange accidents for people who interfered with his control over family finances. She was worried that contacting you directly might put both of us at risk. So she gathered evidence to expose Frank and Patricia's crimes as a way to safely reunite us. Dorothy spent her final 2 years building a case that would destroy Frank and Patricia's power to hurt anyone else. She wanted you to learn the truth about your family while ensuring that Frank could never again use threats and manipulation to separate people who loved each other. Walsh had been listening quietly, but now he opened another file folder containing documents I'd never seen before. "There's more to Dorothy's plan," he said gently. "She arranged for Sarah to inherit the family house in Portland, where she's been living, ensuring you'd both have financial security and the freedom to build whatever relationship feels right." Dorothy had thought of everything. She'd exposed Frank and Patricia's crimes, protected elderly victims from future abuse, compensated everyone they'd hurt, reunited me with my biological mother, and provided both of us with the resources needed to heal from 28 years of forced separation. Sarah and I spent the next 3 hours sharing stories about our parallel lives, discovering similarities that felt like genetic echoes across the decades of separation. We'd both become nurses, both loved reading mystery novels, both preferred coffee over tea, both had the same habit of organizing thoughts by writing lists. "I want to know everything about your childhood," Sarah said. "I want to understand what Frank and Patricia were like as parents, whether they showed you love even while keeping us apart." They provided for my basic needs, but always made it clear that their affection was conditional on my good behavior and lack of curiosity about family history. I spent my entire childhood trying to earn love that they were never willing to give freely. Sarah's anger was visible as I described Frank and Patricia's emotional distance, their preference for Jake, their subtle but constant messages that I was less important than their biological child. "They stole 28 years from both of us," Sarah said quietly. "Years when I could have been your mother, when Dorothy could have been your great-grandmother, when our family could have been whole. But they didn't win." I replied, thinking about Dorothy's garden blooming outside, about the foundation protecting elderly victims, about Frank and Patricia, spending their lives in federal prison. Dorothy made sure their cruelty eventually led to justice for everyone they hurt. Sarah smiled through her tears. "Dorothy always said that love was stronger than fear, that truth was more powerful than lies, that justice would eventually prevail if good people refused to give up fighting." As afternoon turned to evening, Sarah and I walked through Dorothy's garden, planning the future we'd finally be able to build together. She would move back to our hometown to help run the Elder Protection Foundation, using her nursing experience to support elderly abuse victims. "I want to honor Dorothy's sacrifice by spending my life protecting vulnerable people from predators like Frank and Patricia," Sarah said. "She died to give us this chance for reunion and healing." The foundation was expanding rapidly, providing legal support for elderly fraud victims, education programs for vulnerable seniors, and advocacy for stronger protection laws. Dorothy's $5 million legacy was generating enough income to fund comprehensive elderly protection services throughout the region. But most importantly, Sarah and I were finally free to love each other without fear of Frank's threats or manipulation. 28 years of forced separation had ended, and we had the rest of our lives to build the mother-daughter relationship that had been stolen from us. "Do you think Dorothy knew this would be the outcome when she started gathering evidence against Frank and Patricia?" Sarah asked, as we stood among the roses she'd planted during her final months. "I think Dorothy knew that love and truth would eventually triumph over cruelty and lies, even if she didn't live to see it happen personally," I replied. She had faith that justice would be served and families would be healed. As the sun set over Dorothy's garden, I realized that her death had given birth to something beautiful and lasting. The foundation would protect elderly people for generations. Sarah and I would have the relationship we'd been denied for decades, and Frank and Patricia would spend their lives in prison, knowing they'd ultimately failed to destroy the love they'd tried so hard to eliminate. Dorothy Morrison had won completely, and her legacy would continue growing long after Frank and Patricia were forgotten. Now, as I share this story with you, I want to ask you something important. Have you ever noticed elderly people in your community who might be vulnerable to financial manipulation or abuse? Are there neighbors, relatives, or family friends who seem isolated or confused about money, matters in ways that could signal predatory targeting? The truth is, Frank and Patricia's crimes were only possible because our community failed to recognize warning signs that, in retrospect, were clearly visible for years. They operated successfully because people like us didn't know what to look for or how to report suspicious behavior. Dorothy's story taught me that protecting vulnerable people requires all of us to stay alert, ask questions, and speak up when something doesn't seem right. Every elderly person deserves to live with dignity and security, free from predators who view their trust as weakness to exploit. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about elderly protection, please like this video, share it with people who need to hear Dorothy's message, and subscribe to ensure you don't miss future stories about justice prevailing against those who prey on vulnerable people. Thank you for listening to Dorothy Morrison's story and for caring enough about elderly protection to spend this time learning about how love can triumph over cruelty when good people refuse to give up fighting for what's right. May we all find the courage to protect those who need our help, and may we never forget that justice, though sometimes delayed, ultimately prevails when truth and love guide our actions.